Let me introduce our keynote speaker for today's program. He's a very humble gentleman who has experienced life from a very different angle and also sees the world in a different or a vivid lens, I would say. He's none other than Dr. Lakshal Perera, photographer of awesome stuff, an ethical photography advocate, recovering scientist and kids bookshop owner. Dr. Lakshal will have some of his views on today's topic, hope, the Pandora View, significance of mythological behavior. Over to you, sir.
My name is Lakshal. Thank you so much for having me here. I'm speaking to you from my home in a little country town called Keynote. It's about 100 kilometres north of Melbourne in Australia. I firstly want to say a really big thank you to the National Olympic Committee of Sri Lanka for inviting me to speak to you today. It's a very unexpected but humbling opportunity that I have today, and I hope there is something of benefit or inspiration for you in what I have to say today. I also want to acknowledge that I'm joining to you from the lands of the Tungarang people, who were the Aboriginal people of this area before colonisation. I pay my respects to their elders, past, present and emerging, and recognise that their sovereignty was never ceded and that we live and work on their stolen land. So my address today is not really about sport. As much as I would love for it to be, I'm not really qualified to talk about it. I did play soccer for about 25 years, but didn't really get me anywhere, unfortunately. But today I'm going to talk about something that I do know quite well, and that is my life and my experiences. And it will be an opportunity to discuss where my hope comes from, particularly at this really, really challenging time. I'll share my story and how various strategies have helped me navigate through some of the challenging times. And hopefully there's just a tiny bit of inspiration or an idea in there which can help you get through what has no doubt been two of the most difficult years in your lives. I truly believe that with optimism, ideas and action, you can not only build hope and positive outcomes for yourself, but also for your communities. So my Greek mythology is not great. I actually needed to do a little bit of research before this presentation to polish up on some details. So I apologize for the simplicity of this explanation. But in essence, according to these myths, Pandora was the first woman made by the gods. She received a jar which contained all of the evils of humanity in the world, and she was told not to open it. But she did, and that released all of the evils into the world. She quickly closed the jar, but the only thing that remained inside this jar was hope. So how do we interpret this? Does that mean hope was an evil that was still remaining inside the jar? If it is evil, then we should be glad that it's locked inside, because living with anticipation of good things that never arrive is quite a torment in itself. The holding out of hope for something to happen is painful at times. The anticipation can be as bad as knowing that it's not going to happen. Have you ever felt that anxiety in your chest when you're waiting and you're hoping that something will happen? Even when you know you've done your absolute best to influence it. So like, maybe even thinking about waiting for your exam results. You've worked really, really hard, but you still have that anticipation and that hope in your heart that you will do well. And it's still a worrying time until it comes back to you. But on the other hand, if hope is good, being stuck inside the jar is a sad thing, isn't it? What good is a life without hope? If you're in a difficult situation, isn't there positivity in the hope that things may soon be okay? We're all sitting here hoping that the pandemic will finish and that we can move on with our lives. It's this hope that makes us take positive steps every day, like joining online for this academy. If there was no hope, none of us would be here, right? Like we wouldn't come. So which is it? Is hope good or evil? I don't know. I don't know what the actual answer is. So I'm going to steal an idea from a guy called Dr. John Messerly. Not because it's agreed upon that this is an accurate interpretation or that it's, you know, it's better than any other one, but because I like it. I like that interpretation. And he says, perhaps hope is good, and it is good that it remained in the jar. Perhaps hope was originally another evil, but after being opened, hope was transformed into good hope. It's as if hope, separated from evil, takes on a new character. He also says, hope is not an expectation, but an attitude that leads us to act rather than despair. I know that each of us is different. We've all had different life experiences, different ideas of who we are. Some of us think that we're the ones who are good at maths. Some of us think that we're good at sport. Some of us think that we come from really healthy, successful families. Some of us think that we may have had a hard time at school. And some of us believe that hope is transformative, and others believe that it's just a lie that will end in disappointment. So it is our own perception of our lives and our experiences and the pathways that we take to decide what hope is. So in saying all of that, I think that for each of us, hope is what we make of it. And that's a challenging idea though, because some of us are more privileged than others. You know, some of us are more gifted than others. Some of us have worked harder than others. But despite all of these things, I believe it is possible to remain hopeful regardless of where we stand in life. But how in the world is it possible to be hopeful? We live in a time of war, climate change, catastrophic deforestation, terrorism, and pandemics. Young people like you experience many issues: cost of living, mental health, lack of opportunities, a feeling of what's the point? Problems in Australia, there's problems in Sri Lanka, there's problems all around the world. And it seems like there's just no solution sometimes. So for some of us, it may feel impossible to feel hopeful. And I know that there are days when I feel really cynical about the world and wonder where we're headed and how we can possibly continue to exist like this. In particular, the pandemic has been really challenging for so many of us. There's been so many deaths and so many people that are really unwell. There's been lockdowns, like, you know, Melbourne and the area that I live in, we've been in lockdown for about 250 days in the last year. I don't know what it's like for you guys in Sri Lanka. I know that things are pretty bad at the moment. You know, we've all had difficulty with work and study and family and financial pressure. I don't know if any of you have children, but, you know, being stuck inside with a small child, not being able to go anywhere, these are really, really hard things. And there's uncertainty about what's ahead of us. Like, are there more variants around the corner? Are we going to have more lockdowns? Are there going to be more people that die, people that we know? We just don't know. So in this time of uncertainty, it is really difficult to be hopeful. So we have to ask ourselves, where can this hope come from? It's an anticipation. It's an optimistic mindset. It's a positive way of viewing the world. It thinks the best of situations. You're a glass half full person, and optimism and hope that it creates are a frame of mind. It's the belief that things will be okay. Some of us are naturally inclined to be this way. Put your hand up if you think you're an optimist in general. Nobody. That's okay. That's fine. This is exactly what I'm saying. Everybody's circumstances are different, right? But other, you know, there are optimists amongst us. Some of us are optimists, yes, but there are others who are, you know, more cynical and pessimistic, including people like me. And for many people, their reality doesn't allow them to feel hope. How can you expect a resident living in a bombed out building in Syria somewhere, hiding from rocket attacks, to feel as hopeful as me, sitting in comfort in my home in peaceful Australia? How can you feel hopeful or optimistic, especially right now in the middle of this pandemic? People have lost so many of their friends and families to the virus. Their community connections have been devastated. They've missed out on so many things, friendships, births, deaths, and important events in our lives. It's been awful in so many ways. But I believe that the interpretation of Pandora and hope from earlier, where hope can arise from despair, I believe in that. I think that hope can actually come from a lack of hope. I think that's because when we're backed into a corner, we become desperate to find a solution. A crisis makes us think creatively and come up with new ideas. For example, when we look at climate change, we've invented electric cars, wind turbines, carbon capture technology, and you know, we're looking at this COVID pandemic, and we've developed this mRNA vaccine in 11 months. There's also a shift towards more authoritarian and fascist governments all around the world, but young people are nearly universally progressive, much more progressive. Look at who protests governments the most around the world. If we look at places like Hong Kong, Iran, the USA, the people leading these protests are always university students. They're young, inspired, hopeful people. The people from your generation want fairness and justice for all people, not just the wealthy and powerful. These are some of the beautiful things which can come out of the tough situations that we're in. And they give me hope for the future, that things may be better. Working ourselves out of challenging situation makes us feel empowered, creative, and like we have something that we can do and can work towards. You may have even felt this yourself. Have you ever felt stuck when you're doing something, but then for a moment you have a great idea, and within that moment everything feels wonderful. You feel like, this is it, I can do it, right? I know that this has happened to me, and I hope it's happened to you as well. But it's hard when the reality of the situation comes back in and you see how much work there is to be done. That's the really difficult part to get through. So how do we keep this feeling going? How do we keep that excitement and that hope? How do we keep it constantly? Well, it's hard, and I think we would be setting ourselves up to fail if we needed to feel hopeful all the time. It's exhausting, and I think we're allowed to feel hopeless or cynical sometimes. I think that that's normal and healthy. But eventually we need to get out of these places in our minds, and before we're trapped there forever. So to reflect, and we need to reflect on that situation that we're in and what needs to happen for us to feel hopeful again. So this looks different for each of us because hope comes from different places for each of us. For some of us, it comes from spirituality or religion. Some believe in performing good deeds and that karma will repay them in this life and next. Or maybe they believe that everything that happens in this life is as a result of their God's will. And if they follow this path, they will reach heaven. These beliefs are great if they help you to find hope. But I'm not religious, and I know that there are others out there who find it from another source. Some may be just optimistic people and believe and hope that things will be okay. Others like me take it one step further and believe that there needs to be an action that goes with that optimism. So it's a frame of mind that's followed by something else. I think to be hopeful, we have to have something to work towards, a goal. This gives us a focus, a meaning in what we're doing. I also think we need to think about the way we get to that goal, the strategy. And I also think it's really important that we have belief in ourselves that we can achieve what we want to. But I have not always felt this way. So even though I'm speaking in a really kind of authoritative way right now, and I'm trying to be inspiring, I haven't felt like this forever. I'm 40 now, and this is only something that's developed in the last 15 to 20 years of my life. Before that, things looked very different. I was born in Australia in 1981, and I moved back to Sri Lanka with my mum and dad when I was 9 months. I returned to Australia when I was 7. I had a very thick accent. Sinhalese was the first language that I spoke. I could speak English, but it wasn't great. And yeah, things were hard. This is my school photo from when I was 11. What do you notice? Well, nearly everyone else is white, right? So what does that mean? Well, for me, it meant that I was always on the outer. I was visibly different. And you think, why does that matter? Well, maybe in some places it doesn't, but here it does, because I'm brown and Australia is a country full of mostly white people, and it's a country that has a significant problem with racism. There are lots and lots of amazing, inclusive and diverse people in Australia, but most of these people still believe that racism is a really, really big issue. Check out how many Google results there are if you type in racism in Australia. There's 125 million, right? So this is a massive problem here. And this goes back a long time into Australia's history as a country. It was built on the back of the genocide of the Aboriginal and Torres Strait Islander people following the arrival of the British in 1788. In the years after their arrival, hundreds and hundreds of thousands of Aboriginal people were killed by these colonialists. They were considered subhuman, like animals really. And for 50 years after arrival, there was no penalty for killing Aboriginal people. This is a map of Australia showing all the lands of the various Aboriginal and Torres Strait Islander people. These are hundreds and hundreds of languages and unique cultures that were all wiped out by the colonial forces. The White Australia policy, which started in 1901, restricted non-white people from moving to Australia. And Aboriginal and Torres Strait Islander people were voiceless and they were not allowed to vote until 1962. Between 1910 and the 1970s, tens of thousands of Aboriginal children were forcibly taken from their families and moved to missions. These people were called the Stolen Generation. This destroyed their communities, and Aboriginal people, children grew up not knowing their land, their language, or their culture. The Australian government tried to kill off the Aboriginal people. It was a genocide. And this history of white supremacy and white dominance of all others still persists to this day. Whether you're Indigenous or you're a migrant like me, some people believe that if you're not white, you're not right. So just as an aside, if you're interested in finding out a little bit more about the Stolen Generation, there's a really amazing movie called Rabbit Proof Fence. It's based on a true story about some young Aboriginal sisters who were taken away to a mission, only to escape and travel over 2,000 kilometres overland to find their families. And this history of racism is actually partly why I did my acknowledgement of country at the start. That's a traditional thing that we are trying to make more common in Australian society, where we acknowledge the lands of the Aboriginal people that we're on, because like I said, these lands were stolen from them and they were never, and was never acknowledged. So we're trying to do that now. So how did this racism affect me? Well, this systemic and interpersonal racism that I experienced, it happened all the time when I was a child. I was called Vegemite. People didn't talk to me. They said that my skin was dirty, and it made me hate being brown. As an isolated 8-year-old, I was ashamed of my Sri Lankan culture and I just wanted to be white. I remember when I was in year 3 and doing bush dancing at school. Don't know if you guys know what bush dancing is, but it's a very Australian thing where you dance. It's an old colonial thing where you dance in pairs, often in circles, and there's boys on the inside or the outside and girls on the inside ring. And then the groups kind of rotate around. So everybody gets to dance with everybody else. And it's a social kind of activity that was done. But my experience was not social at all. There were 2 girls in my class who refused to hold my hands during the bush dancing because of the color of my skin. They didn't want to touch my brown skin. I was so young, but I had already been taught this life lesson that I am not one of them and I was below them. Because of that and experiences like that, I just wanted to blend in, just to be unexceptional and to not have any identity. I didn't want any opinions that would stand out, no ideas, no thinking about what I wanted in life. I just kind of went with the flow, right? But all of this changed when I was about 18. It was at that time I started to play music in front of people. I performed with my guitar, singing my own songs and covers by my favorite musicians, including Jeff Buckley and Radiohead. I love the freedom and feeling of performance. I love the applause and the fact that these people were there watching and listening to me. I had a power over them and I'd never had that before. In this time, I still hadn't quite worked out how to be hopeful, but I worked hard. I learned a lot and I enjoyed the opportunities that music allowed me to have. But even without hope, I started to believe that I was worthy of having a voice. I was worthy of being respected. And most of all, I started to believe in myself. I had always done quite well at school. It wasn't something that I found particularly challenging. My parents, being classic Sri Lankan migrant parents, they strove for me to work very hard. And I always figured out the best ways to avoid it and to do the minimum required. But despite that, I did quite well at school. I was able to get a double degree in electrical engineering and physics, did a master's in medical physics, and then a PhD in medical physics. And I worked for a while as a research scientist at the Queensland Uni of Tech, having received a postdoctoral research fellowship there. So you think based on all of these things that I would be considered, successful, right? I know, especially in Sri Lanka, there are limited opportunities for students to enter university education. And because of that and the way that my parents kind of looked at life, they definitely believed that I was on the right pathway to success in Australia. I had a job, I had made a decent wage, I owned an apartment. That's seemingly the idea of success in most migrant families. But despite what I look like, I am not a Sri Lankan child, right? I'm a child of Sri Lankan parents that grew up in Australia, surrounded by Australians and much more Western ways of thinking. I don't know how Sri Lankan children think because I didn't grow up there. I wasn't surrounded by the cultural norms. So because of this, my success on paper did not translate to satisfaction in real life. I was told by the society that I lived in that I could do whatever I wanted to. I could follow my dreams. Like, I know that that's not something that most migrant families believe in. It's like, you do this and you follow this path and you do it. Doesn't matter how unhappy you are, you just do it, right? But I didn't know what my dreams were. But I knew that I hated my job. I hated the city that I lived in. I hated my boss. I hated the fact that I couldn't make any friends. I hated the weather. I felt like I was stuck in a career that I didn't enjoy, and I couldn't imagine what 50 years of this would look like. I would lie in bed every morning trying to think of excuses to not go to work, and I knew that that was not good. I had recognized that while I loved science, I didn't love being a scientist. They're different. I couldn't imagine working like this. It just was not something I saw myself doing for the rest of my life. But what I could imagine myself doing was photography. This was an obsession that I picked up. And I had bought my first camera during my PhD. I was on a $20,000 a year Australian scholarship, which sounds like a lot, but in Australian terms, I suppose it's not massive. And I was living at home. So I had all of this disposable income, I suppose, for the first time ever. So I went out and I spent it all on cameras, lenses and lights. Like I just bought everything I could afford. And after every work day, I would come home and photograph and edit and develop my craft and try to become the best photographer I could be. And I decided a really good way to do this was to undertake what was called a 52-week project. It's a photographic project where you take a self-portrait each week for a whole year. So this is a selection of some of the photos from that project, which you can kind of see are a little bit crazy. Some of them are funny, some of them just a bit wild, some of them a bit scary, I suppose. But I started and I was slowly learning about lighting and Photoshop and editing. But as the weeks went on, my creativity and ideas, they overflowed. I knew that there was something there. Like, this was not work. This is something that just came to me. I had a document and I just filled it with notes. I planned my images meticulously. I was thinking about lighting. I was thinking about backgrounds. I was thinking about how I'm going to edit and composite these things. It consumed me for all the hours that I wasn't stuck at my real job. This project saw me find lots of attention online. Some of these images were viewed hundreds of thousands of times and appeared in media all around Australia and the world. And all of these images kind of tell a little bit of a story about my life. And I felt like I had a lot to say through them. And again, there were people who were listening. From self-portraits, I moved into combining photography with my other love, music. What little money I had left after buying all my camera stuff, I spent going to watch live music. I can't remember where I first discovered this, but I found out that I could go and watch music for free if I was the official photographer at the show. Or a official photographer at the show. So I started volunteering for a small music website, photographing for them in tiny, poorly lit, smoky venues. I had my images appear on their websites, and slowly from there, over time, it progressed to bigger and bigger and better things. People could see that I had a pretty solid portfolio, and that I was good at what I did. I was able to photograph big international acts, big festivals, and also sold a few photos to artists and magazines. But it's impossible to make a living from being a music photographer in Australia. So this was a dead end road in terms of career, but I didn't really care. I lived for the evenings and weekends so I could photograph and enjoy music. But for the rest of the time, I was miserable. But this all changed when I met Kristen. She's an inspiring and amazing person who changed my life and ways of thinking. And I can just hear her. She's just come home with our daughter from school, so I can hear them in the background. Kristen had come from a really, really awful childhood herself. So she knew what it felt like to be on the outside. But despite this, she knew that the way for her to achieve anything in life was to get out of the town that she lived in, to get away from the dysfunctional family and the community she was a part of. So she worked really, really hard to escape there. She worked full-time in a shop while also studying full-time at a shop, so at university. So 40 hours a week of working, and then 40 hours or whatever more of study as well as, cooking, cleaning, managing her house, all that jazz. She ultimately went on to get 4 university degrees and then worked at a really, really high level in the humanitarian sector, working with the UN, the Red Cross. She was actually a delegate that got deployed to disaster sites around the world. And she worked with many community organizations supporting the most vulnerable members in our communities. She's amazing and incredible. And I married her, so that was pretty good. The one thing that Kristen always knew was when that something didn't fit her values or made her unhappy, it was time to move on. Now, that's not something that I was good at. That's not something that my family's culture really supported. It's like I said before, you take this path and you follow it. But Kristen's road was just like this. There were paths this way, paths that way, paths this way and that way. She took very well calculated risks to keep searching for that contentment and that satisfaction. And she knew that I was looking for that too. She knew I was unhappy with my career, but was always really encouraging and supported, pushed, and instilled confidence in me. She reminded me that I didn't need to be unhappy and that I could achieve whatever I wanted to. Whatever it was, I just needed a plan and to work towards it. So this is when everything changed for me. She gave me the hope that I had craved for so long. I knew where I wanted to go, and that in itself was the hope that I needed. So when my contract at the university ended, we moved from Brisbane, where we live, to Melbourne, and I decided that it was time to transition into being a photographer. As part of this, I wanted to travel. I wanted to meet similar-minded people, and I wanted to be successful in the ways that I measure success. And that's through how happy I was, how satisfied I was with my job, and how much I enjoyed my life. Kristen helped me map out a path to get to this, and I worked really, really hard to make it happen, generally working 10 to 12 hours a day, 6 to 7 days a week. Within 6 months of starting my business, I had booked 20 weddings. And then over the next 4 years, I shot 40 to 50 weddings per year. I traveled all around Australia to do this, and also to 15 countries around the world, including Sweden, Canada, India, Malaysia, New Zealand, France, Italy, the UK, US, all over the place, just to photograph. I had multiple magazine covers, lots of appearances on wedding websites and blogs, and was asked to speak at events and workshops too. I met some amazing people who are still my best friends to this day. But despite this, the wedding industry in Australia and probably much of the Western world is actually really, really unethical. It's focused on making as much money as possible. So people just get ripped off all the time. And it's only ever really representative of white and conventionally attractive couples. If you look at most wedding websites in the Western world, you don't find a single person that looks like me, right? Maybe that's kind of shifting a little bit, but that's how it was when I was kind of really in the deep, in the really serious time that I was working. I found all of these things to be quite distasteful. It didn't really fit my values at all. My life experiences, including all the way back to that bush dancing kind of experience in year 3, had made me want to be a really inclusive and kind person, someone that could make everyone feel like they could be themselves with no pretense. Again, I found myself not fitting into my community. But this time, rather than hiding away and hoping that things got better like I did as a child, I decided I was going to act. So with Kristen's incredible mind and sense of justice, I continued to keep building my practice, but really focus on making it an ethical photography practice, and started presenting ways for others to transition their businesses into ethical photography as well. I encourage them to not only act from a humanistic perspective, but also to change things as fundamental as the bank that they choose to use and the fund that manages their pensions. In Australia, it's possible for these bodies to be ethics driven, so they won't invest in fossil fuels or tobacco or deforestation, just to name some things. And it was possible for us to live authentic and meaningful lives and to engage with other people in a way that brought value to each of us. I was asked to write my ideas in a UK photography magazine with a monthly column. And I hope that there's still some photographers out there who still use this framework that Kristen and I developed in running their businesses and operations. But then in 2016, all of that changed again. My priority shifted when our daughter Vega was born. We had been told we couldn't have children, and we were in the process of adopting when Vega came along. She was so loved and so wanted, and everything else felt secondary after her birth, as we just both wanted to be with her. But even if my sole commitment was to be my work, that would have proven to be really, really challenging because Vega just did not sleep. She had silent reflux, which meant she would feed 5 to 6 times each night and need to be held upright for 45 minutes to reduce her discomfort and vomiting. She would be asleep during this time, but Kristen was awake. And after an hour or so, Vega would wake up and need another feed. So, and I couldn't really take over any of the workload because Vega refused to drink from a bottle. So that first couple of years was just really, 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 really tough time. And, you know, Australia is very different in the way that we raise babies, especially compared to places like Sri Lanka, because all of the health care kind of support people say, you shouldn't have the baby in the room, in the bed with you. Right? You shouldn't sleep with the baby, but we did. We had Vega in the bed with us for a lot of the time. And yeah, so you don't really get support from elsewhere for that stuff either. But despite this really, really challenging time, Kristen had her sights set on her childhood dream of starting a bookshop. She was on maternity leave for 6 months. And when Vega was 5 months old, we walked past this beautiful space on the main street of our town. Very quickly, Kristen did all of the research that was required to commit to this idea, and she resigned from her job to start Squishy Mini Bookstore. And that shop's name, it actually comes from the name of the bookshop that Kristen had always imagined her having when she was a child. And the model for Squishy was very much like a community organisation or a not-for-profit rather than a business which sold books. Kristen's focus was about supporting literacy for the most vulnerable kids in our community. She was 8 when she learned how to read, and she wanted to offer better opportunities than she received. And there's lots of kids that are in similar scenarios or situations to her around where we live. So very quickly, the shop developed a national and international following, but most importantly, it really connected with our local community and people knew that we were doing something that was valuable. But then the pandemic arrived in March 2020 and it impacted everything. Squishy closed and all my photography bookings were cancelled or postponed. We weren't sure how we were going to get through or how we'd manage to pay our bills, but thankfully, both our state and federal governments were able to create programs to offer financial support to businesses and individuals to keep things going. Without these payments, things would have been pretty dire for us. As we fluctuated in and out of lockdowns and restrictions, Chris and I recognised that the best thing that we could do was to try and keep our community connected. I had been reading stories and playing songs for the toddlers and babies in our shop with story time. I've been doing that weekly since we opened, and this story time was the event to be at in our town on a Thursday morning. In pre-COVID times, we would sometimes have like 150 people in the shop for story time, which is chaos. But it was wild, and it was a wonderful celebration of reading and literacy and music and joy. It was also a regular routine as part of the littlest members of our community. So it was really important to keep that going as much as we could, even though the pandemic was, upending all of our lives. To give them some sense of what was of normality in what was a pretty abnormal time for them. So Kristen negotiated all of the copyright issues that existed with reading and recording books being read with the publishers, and she transitioned us to moving to online storytime. So I would go in each week and record myself reading stories and singing songs, and we uploaded these to YouTube. And we had thousands and thousands of views from children, not only in our region and Melbourne, but also all around Australia and sometimes even overseas. We had so many messages thanking us, saying, thanks for giving us a 30-minute break, each week. And some even said that their kids would do story time to their dolls and teddy bears and pretend to be me and sing our hello song to the teddies, which is pretty cute. So Kristen's full of wonderful ideas, and she had one of our staff members deliver books on horseback because our employee, the junior, she was an avid rider. And this led to us being featured in The Guardian and the BBC and other Australian publications. So we knew that what we were doing was making a difference to people everywhere. But in the middle of all of this, my photography sat dormant. I wasn't permitted to go to Melbourne or to be in the company of other people, and this effectively stopped mine and all other Victorian photography businesses from operating. I was already pretty weary from 5 years of bad sleep, and owning a small business is a 7-day-a-week job. You're constantly receiving emails that need to be addressed, and there's no concept of a weekend or a public holiday. You work when there's work to be done, and that's basically all the time. So I suppose imagine that, but across 2 separate businesses. Even though Kristen did 90% of the work for the bookshop, I was still responsible for lots of stuff behind the scenes. And the first 6 months of the pandemic was a pretty interesting time. We were mostly stuck inside, but our finances and major worry were mostly taken care of by the government, which we're so fortunate for. So sometimes we actually didn't have much to do. So I spent time learning how to cook all sorts of amazing new food, played lots of soccer with Vega, or we'd go for 1-hour walks with the whole family. And this is the maximum outdoor time we were permitted each day. So I had lots of time to think, and it dawned on me, the passion to run my photography business was just not there anymore. I still loved photographing, but I now resented missing out on all of my Saturdays where I was away photographing weddings, and I was missing out on Vega playing soccer and hanging out with Kristen. And I just wanted to be home with them. But thankfully, I now have enough experience with these things. Like, I'm unhappy. What do I do? What do I do? But I knew that if I wanted something, I just needed to figure out how to get there. And thankfully, a seed was planted by a friend in my mind, and this blossomed into a giant tree. I decided I was going to go back to university to train to be a teacher. I'd coached a local under-16 soccer team, and one of the players' mothers was the teacher who asked me to come and work with her school in a Year 10 classroom as an educational support officer. It's kind of like a quasi-teacher that supports the main teacher, and you don't really need any qualifications, except you need to be able to get along with the young people and support the teacher in whatever they need. The young people I was working with had very low literacy. Some could barely read, even though they were, 15 or 16. Some of them had significant learning disabilities, while others, they just came from really, really challenging family environments where they'd experienced trauma and abuse. Many of them refused to come to school. And when they did, our classroom was in a constant state of chaos with talking, interrupting, and behavioural challenges. But as the year went on, the students were able to connect, and the teacher and I recognised the ability that I had to engage with young, vulnerable people. And it felt like I was really making a difference. I'd always loved teaching. I'd been a lab demonstrator and seasonal lecturer when I was at university. I'd also privately tutored maths to high school kids for my whole university life. So these experiences, along with my experience that I just had in that classroom, showed me I could handle it and that I would enjoy whatever was ahead of me. So I'm currently training to be a primary and secondary teacher in Australia, and I've just completed the first year of my 2-year masters. I've had 2 professional placements in 2 very, very different environments. One with 5-year-olds in their first year of school in foundation at a local government school. And my second placement was with year 11 and 12 physics students at a high academic achieving private school. So about as opposite as you could get. But despite these 2 really, really different experiences, I really loved both of them and felt like I learned a lot about myself and also about teaching. So now that I've shared my story, I suppose I can reflect on what I've done and how I create hope and excitement for the future. I know that what I'm doing contributes positively to our community and the wider world through encouraging photographers to act with integrity. I know that our bookshop supports literacy in young people, and it grows tolerance and understanding of diversity within the community. And as a teacher, my goal is to encourage all students and learners to view the world with wonder, determination, and empathy. These things, which use my skills and abilities, will create positive change. I also have hope because we're raising our daughter to navigate her life in a way which follows an ethos of compassion and kindness. I know these will serve her well in her life, and I know they will support other people as well who interact with her to have better lives too. My hope comes from the optimism of the next generation. I know that they will recognize that there's lots of errors and mistakes that we have made, and they're going to work towards making the lives of all people around the world more equitable and fair. And this includes you. This is you that I'm talking about. I know that you're incredibly gifted, talented, intelligent young people. You've worked incredibly hard to get where you are now. And I know that it's possible for you to use the things which you possess, just like I did, to make your lives as fulfilling as possible. Through this, you may end up making the lives of others better too. I know that the opportunities that I've had in Australia are very different to what you have over there, but you can still remain hopeful because your potential lies within your hearts and your minds, and also within the plans that you generate for your future. So I will leave you to take the next step now. For most of us, hope will not just come and fall into our laps. We must think, we must be creative. We have to find solutions to the problems which cause us despair. This pandemic has taken so much hope away from us, and we need to work incredibly hard to bring it back. But I believe in you, and I know that it is possible. Thank you, everyone.